The late autumn of 1868 brought an unusual chill to McLean County, Illinois. The Civil War had ended just 3 years prior, leaving the nation in a fragile state of reconstruction. In this backdrop of tentative recovery, the small farming community of Bloomington found itself confronted with a mystery that would perplex authorities and haunt the collective memory of its citizens for decades to come. On November 12, 1868, at approximately 7:15 a.m., as frost still clung to the barren fields surrounding the Williams Orphan Asylum, a young boy named James Elias Worrell, just 9 years old, was discovered missing from his bed. James had arrived at the asylum only 6 months earlier, following the death of his parents in a fire that consumed their modest home on the outskirts of Springfield. The staff at Williams, particularly the head caretaker, Mrs. Eleanor Gresham, had noted that James was a peculiarly quiet child who rarely spoke and spent hours staring out of windows, as if waiting for someone only he could see. The morning routine at the Williams Asylum was strict and unwavering. Children rose at 6:30 a.m., dressed in the institution's standard gray uniform, and proceeded to the dining hall for a simple breakfast of porridge and bread before morning prayers. It was during the head count before breakfast that Mrs. Gresham noticed James's absence. His bed had been slept in, the thin wool blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a habit James had maintained since his arrival. The child was not one to wander, Mrs. Gresham would later tell the Bloomington Daily Pantagraph reporter. He followed our routines with precision, almost as if he feared deviation would bring calamity. The initial search of the asylum grounds yielded no results. The building, a 3-story brick structure built in 1842 to house the county's growing number of orphaned children, was thoroughly inspected. The staff searched every room, every closet, every conceivable hiding place a child might find appealing. The grounds, enclosed by a wrought iron fence standing 6 feet tall, showed no signs of disturbance. The gates remained locked, the key still hanging in Mrs. Gresham's office. The surrounding area of Bloomington in 1868 was a patchwork of farmland, scattered wooded areas, and the expanding railroad network that had brought prosperity to this part of Illinois. The nearby Illinois Central Railroad had a station less than a mile from the orphanage, connecting the town to Chicago in the north and Springfield to the south. The weather conditions on the morning of James's disappearance were particularly harsh. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ground with a thin white blanket that would have captured any child's footprints had they ventured outside. By noon, Mrs. Gresham had notified Sheriff Thomas Rutledge, who arrived with 3 deputies to expand the search. The snowfall had intensified, hampering efforts and creating an increased sense of urgency. A child without proper winter attire would not survive long in such conditions. "We organized 40 men from town," Sheriff Rutledge documented in his official report. "We formed search parties to comb the woods along Sugar Creek and the areas surrounding the railroad tracks. The snow made tracking difficult, but also meant the boy couldn't have gone far without leaving some trace. What made James's disappearance particularly concerning was the boy's peculiar medical history. Since arriving at the orphanage, he had experienced what the institution's physician, Dr. Malcolm Harper, described as episodes of unusual clarity regarding matters beyond his possible knowledge. These episodes manifested as detailed descriptions of people and places James had never encountered, recounting them with such precision that it unnerved those who heard him speak. "The boy once described a farmhouse interior 20 miles from here," Dr. Harper noted in his medical journal. "He spoke of a grandfather clock with a crack in the face, a faded daguerreotype of twins on the mantel, and a rocking chair with a carving of an eagle on the armrest. When I happened to visit this very farmhouse weeks later to attend to a patient, I was astonished to find every detail exactly as the boy had described, down to the crack in the clock face." The owner confirmed no child had ever visited their home. By nightfall on November 12th, as the search parties returned empty-handed and the temperature continued to drop, the mood at Williams Asylum had shifted from concern to grim resignation. The other children, 37 in total, were kept indoors, huddled together as staff attempted to maintain normalcy while whispering theories about what might have happened to James. If you want to follow more cases like this one, that shake entire communities and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. 3 days into the search, on November 15th, a discovery was made that would transform James's disappearance from a local tragedy to something far more disturbing. A maintenance worker at the Evergreen Cemetery, located 2 miles from the asylum, found the boy huddled between 2 gravestones, alive but in a state of near catatonia. James was severely hypothermic, his lips blue and fingers showing early signs of frostbite. His gray orphanage uniform was muddied but intact, suggesting he hadn't been changing locations frequently. What perplexed authorities was not just how James had survived 3 nights in freezing temperatures, but why he was found at the cemetery at all. More specifically, why he was found sitting between the graves of the Henderson family, a mother, father, and 3 children who had all perished in a house fire in 1861, 7 years prior. James had no known connection to this family. When Dr. Harper arrived to examine the boy at the scene, James suddenly broke his silence. In a clear, unwavering voice that contrasted starkly with his physical condition, he began to recite details about the deaths of the Henderson family, how the youngest child had awakened to the smell of smoke, how the father had managed to reach the window before collapsing from smoke inhalation, how the mother had been found with her arms around her infant. Details that matched the coroner's report exactly, though that report had been sealed and stored away years before James was even born. Sheriff Rutledge would later write, "The boy spoke as if reading from the official record, yet with the emotion of someone who had witnessed the tragedy firsthand. It was the most unsettling moment of my 16 years in law enforcement." James Elias Worrell was not missing anymore. He had been found. But the mystery of what had happened to him, and how he knew what he knew, was just beginning to unfold. The investigation into James Worrell's case began in earnest on November 16, 1868, after the boy had been stabilized at Bloomington General Hospital. Dr. Harper had diagnosed James with severe hypothermia, moderate malnutrition, and what he termed acute nervous exhaustion. Physical examinations revealed no signs of violence or abuse, yet the boy's psychological state remained deeply concerning. James alternated between periods of complete silence and moments of unsettling lucidity, during which he would speak about the deaths of people he had never met with an intimacy that suggested personal witness. The first priority for Sheriff Rutledge was determining how the child had managed to leave the orphanage undetected and why he had chosen the cemetery as his destination. "We must consider all possibilities," Rutledge wrote in his case notes dated November 17th. "Either the boy left of his own volition, finding some means of escape we have yet to discover, or someone within the institution facilitated his departure. Neither scenario explains his knowledge of the Henderson tragedy or why he sought out their final resting place." The initial interviews with the staff at Williams Asylum revealed little. Mrs. Gresham maintained that the building had been secured according to standard protocol the night before James's disappearance. The night watchman, Frederick Townsend, swore he had made his rounds every hour between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., seeing nothing unusual. The orphanage's registry indicated that no visitors had come to see James during his 6-month stay. One lead emerged from Annabelle Wilson, a kitchen worker who recalled that James had drawn peculiar attention from a visitor to the orphanage approximately 2 weeks before his disappearance. The visitor, a well-dressed man who had come to discuss a donation to the institution, had apparently noticed James in the courtyard and asked several questions about him. "The gentleman seemed particularly interested in the quiet boy by the elm tree," Miss Wilson told the investigators. "He asked if the child was simple-minded or merely shy." When Mrs. Gresham explained about James's parents dying in a fire, the man's face went quite pale. "He left shortly after, and I don't believe he ever made the donation he came to discuss." Unfortunately, Mrs. Gresham had not recorded the man's name, remembering only that he had introduced himself as a businessman from Chicago with philanthropic interests. Attempts to identify this mysterious visitor through inquiries with other charitable institutions in the area proved fruitless. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Dr. Deta Harper decided to interview James directly about his time in the cemetery. On November 19th, as James's physical condition improved, the doctor sat with him alone in the hospital ward. Instead of pressing the boy about his escape from the orphanage, Harper simply asked, "James, why did you go to the Hendersons?" According to Harper's detailed notes of the conversation, James responded with unsettling clarity. "They called me. not with voices you can hear with ears. They showed me how they died, and they weren't the only ones. There are 14 of them now. All fire, all needing someone to remember exactly how it happened. When asked how he knew the details of the Henderson family's deaths, James replied, "I see it when I close my eyes. The smoke, the screaming, the little girl's rag doll burning on the floor beside her. I feel the heat on my skin. I smell their hair burning. I know because I was there, except I wasn't. I was them." This interview represented a turning point in the investigation. Sheriff Rutledge, initially skeptical of supernatural explanations, began to consider whether James might be suffering from a particular form of mental disturbance. He consulted with Dr. Ambrose Thornfield, a specialist in psychological disorders from Chicago, who arrived in Bloomington on November 23rd. Dr. Thornfield's assessment of James was thorough. Over 3 days, he observed the boy, engaged him in conversation, and reviewed Dr. Harper's notes. His preliminary diagnosis suggested that James was experiencing what Thornfield called phantasmal displacement, a condition in which traumatic experiences, such as James's own loss of parents in a fire, could manifest as false memories or visions related to similar tragedies. The boy's mind, unable to process his own trauma, has attached itself to the stories of others who suffered similar fates, Dr. Thornfield wrote in his assessment. What requires explanation, however, is how he has accessed the specific details of these deaths, particularly those of the Henderson family. This theory was tested when Sheriff Rutledge decided to verify James's knowledge of other fire-related deaths. On November 27th, James was presented with a map of McLean County and asked to identify locations where people had died in fires. Without hesitation, the boy placed his finger on 13 different locations, including the Henderson farm and his own former home in Springfield. Investigations into these locations revealed that each one had indeed been the site of a fatal fire within the past decade. In each case, when questioned about specifics, James could provide details that matched official reports, the position of bodies, personal effects found near victims, the suspected origin of the fires, and even conversations that had taken place moments before the tragedies occurred. One particularly striking example involved the Blackwood Mill fire of 1864, in which 5 workers had perished. James described how one victim, Charles Finley, had stopped to retie his bootlace moments before the fire broke out, an action that placed him furthest from the exit and sealed his fate. This detail had been mentioned in a single witness testimony and was not common knowledge, yet James recounted it as if he had observed it personally. The investigation faced a significant obstacle in the form of public interest, which had intensified as rumors about James's unusual abilities spread throughout Bloomington. The Daily Pantagraph published a front-page article on November 30th titled, "The Prophetic Orphan. Does James Worrell Speak with the Dead?" This sensationalistic coverage brought curiosity seekers to the hospital, forcing Sheriff Rutledge to post deputies outside James's ward. Mrs. Gresham, concerned for her institution's reputation, pushed for a more mundane explanation. She suggested that James might have overheard conversations about these tragedies from staff or visitors, memorizing details with an exceptional but not supernatural ability. To test this theory, Rutledge interviewed every staff member at the orphanage, but none could recall discussing the specific details James had recounted, particularly those related to the more obscure cases. A potential breakthrough came on December 3rd, when James, during one of his more communicative periods, mentioned a name unfamiliar to the investigators, Margaret Schuyler. According to James, Margaret had died in a house fire in 1862, alone in her home on the outskirts of Towanda, a small settlement northeast of Bloomington. What made this claim testable was that James provided a specific location that could be verified. Sheriff Rutledge dispatched Deputy William Hayes to Towanda to investigate this claim. Hayes returned 2 days later with remarkable news. There had indeed been a Margaret Schuyler who died in a house fire at the exact location James had specified. However, the record showed the fire had occurred in May of 1859, not 1862 as James had stated, his first verified inaccuracy. More significantly, this case had never been officially documented in the county records that consolidated information about fire-related deaths. The only record existed in the Towanda Church Parish Registry and in the memories of the few local residents who remembered the elderly recluse. This discovery presents us with a paradox, Sheriff Rutledge wrote in his case notes on December 6th. Either the boy has access to information through means we cannot explain, or there exists some connection between these victims and himself that remains hidden from our investigation. As December progressed, James's physical health improved, but his psychological state remained fragile. He continued to experience what Dr. Harper now referred to as visionary episodes, during which he would describe in harrowing detail the final moments of fire victims. These episodes often left the boy exhausted and emotionally drained. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The facts that had been established, James's unexplained disappearance, his survival for 3 days in freezing conditions, his presence at the Henderson graves, and his inexplicable knowledge of multiple fire-related deaths, defied conventional explanation. Yet the investigators remained committed to finding a rational answer to the mystery. What no one realized at this point was that the 14th death James had referenced, the death he had yet to describe in detail, had not yet occurred. By mid-December 1868, the investigation into James Worrell's case had attracted attention beyond McLean County. The Chicago Tribune sent a reporter to Bloomington, and several academics from the newly established Illinois State Normal University expressed interest in studying the boy's unusual abilities. Sheriff Rutledge, protective of both the integrity of his investigation and James's well-being, limited access to the child and maintained strict control over information released to the public. On December 14th, Dr. Harper made a significant discovery while reviewing his notes from previous conversations with James. The boy had consistently referred to 14 deaths, yet had only provided details for 13 incidents, including the Henderson family, counted as a single event, and his own parents. When Harper questioned James about this discrepancy, the boy's response sent a chill through the investigation team. "The 14th hasn't happened yet," James said simply. "But it will be soon. I can already smell the smoke." This statement transformed the nature of the case from a historical mystery to a potentially imminent threat. Sheriff Rutledge immediately ordered deputies to check all public buildings in Bloomington for fire hazards and instructed the volunteer fire brigade to maintain heightened alertness. The question now was whether James's statement represented an actual premonition or was merely another manifestation of his psychological condition. Dr. Thornfield, who had remained in Bloomington to continue observing James, proposed an experiment. On December 16th, under controlled conditions at the hospital, James was asked to provide any details he could about the 14th fire. The session was documented by Dr. Harper, Sheriff Rutledge, and Deputy Hayes, with a stenographer recording James's words verbatim. According to the transcript, James spoke in fragmented sentences, his eyes closed and brow furrowed in concentration. "A blue house, 2 stories, white trim around the windows. A woman in a green dress is cooking. Something burns on the stove. She tries to move the pot, but it falls. The curtains catch first, then the wallpaper. She runs upstairs instead of outside. There's a child. She's trying to reach the child. The stairs collapse. Christmas decorations burning. A pine wreath with red berries." The detail about Christmas decorations struck the investigators as particularly noteworthy, as it suggested a time frame within the next 2 weeks. What followed was an urgent effort to identify any blue 2-story houses in Bloomington and the surrounding areas. Deputies were dispatched to create a catalog of properties matching this description, while fire brigade volunteers delivered warnings about holiday fire safety to all households. On December 18th, a potential breakthrough occurred when Professor Edwin Montgomery, a historian from Illinois State Normal University who had heard about the case, contacted Sheriff Rutledge with an intriguing theory. Montgomery had been researching paranormal claims across the Midwest and had documented several cases of individuals who, following traumatic experiences, reported unusual sensitivities or abilities. What if the trauma of losing his parents in a fire created a kind of psychic aperture in the boy? Professor Montgomery proposed. Not merely a psychological fixation, but an actual opening of perception to similar tragedies across time and space. While Sheriff Rutledge remained skeptical of supernatural explanations, he agreed to meet with Montgomery, who brought with him records of a case from Wisconsin in 1851. A young girl who had survived a steamboat explosion subsequently demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict mechanical failures before they occurred. Her predictions had reportedly saved lives on at least 3 occasions before she died of pneumonia at age 14. Montgomery's research suggested that James might represent a similar phenomenon, a child whose trauma had awakened an extrasensory perception specifically attenuated to fire-related tragedies. This theory, while impossible to prove through conventional means, at least provided a framework for understanding James's knowledge and his compulsion to remember the victims. A more pragmatic development came on December 21st, when Deputy Hayes discovered information about the mysterious visitor who had shown interest in James at the orphanage. Through interviews with staff at other charitable institutions in Chicago, Hayes learned of a man named Tobias Whitcomb, a wealthy industrialist who had lost his family in a house fire in 1863 and had subsequently dedicated substantial resources to orphanages and fire prevention initiatives. Hayes traveled to Chicago to interview Whitcomb, who confirmed he had visited Williams Asylum in late October. Whitcomb explained that his interest in James had been prompted by hearing about a child who had survived a fire similar to the one that had claimed his own family. "I merely wished to see the boy," Whitcomb told Hayes, according to the deputy's report. "Perhaps I thought I might find some comfort in speaking with someone who had experienced a loss like mine. When I saw him in the courtyard, something about his expression, a haunted quality beyond his years, unsettled me deeply. I left without approaching him directly." Whitcomb provided an alibi for the days of James's disappearance, which was verified through multiple witnesses in Chicago. While this eliminated him as a suspect in any wrongdoing, his account added another layer to the growing pattern. James seemed to be a nexus point for fire-related tragedies, drawing connections across time and geography that defied rational explanation. Leave in the comments, "Never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found." As Christmas approached, tension in Bloomington increased. The search for the blue house James had described continued, with over 30 properties identified as potential matches. Extra patrols were assigned to these areas, particularly at night when cooking fires and holiday candles posed the greatest risk. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Dr. Harper noted a marked deterioration in James's condition. The boy became increasingly agitated, repeatedly murmuring about smoke and heat. His temperature fluctuated wildly despite no evidence of infection, and he refused food and water for nearly 24 hours. Harper documented these symptoms as consistent with what he called pre-visionary distress, having observed similar patterns before James's previous detailed recountings of fire victims' experiences. That same evening, around 8:45 p.m., the investigation reached its most astonishing turning point. James, who had finally fallen into a fitful sleep after his day of agitation, suddenly sat bolt upright in his hospital bed and screamed, "She's burning now! Mrs. Winters at the Blue House on Chestnut Street. The child is in the back bedroom." Sheriff Rutledge, who had been meeting with Dr. Harper in an adjacent office, heard the commotion and entered James's room just as a deputy burst in with urgent news. A fire had been reported at 1418 Chestnut Street, the home of Elizabeth Winters, a widow who lived with her 5-year-old daughter. The house was indeed painted blue with white trim. Rutledge and the deputy rushed to the scene, arriving as the volunteer fire brigade was attempting to control the blaze that had already engulfed much of the first floor. Witnesses reported that smoke had been visible for only a few minutes before flames appeared at the windows, suggesting the fire had been burning inside for some time before being noticed. Acting on James's specific information about a child in the back bedroom, Sheriff Rutledge and 2 firefighters circled to the rear of the house. Using ladders from a neighboring property, they reached the second-floor window that James had somehow known about. Inside, they found 5-year-old Catherine Winters, unconscious from smoke inhalation, but still alive, exactly where James had indicated she would be. The rescue of Catherine Winters was successful, but Elizabeth Winters had already succumbed to the fire, trapped when the staircase collapsed, just as James had described in his vision days earlier. When investigators examined the scene the following morning, they discovered the remains of holiday decorations, including a pine wreath with red berries that had hung on the inside of the front door. The precision of James's prediction, down to the specific address and the location of the child within the house, transcended coincidence. Even the most skeptical observers, including some members of the medical community who had dismissed James's case as hysteria or clever deception, were forced to acknowledge that something extraordinary had occurred. Dr. Harper documented in his medical journal on December 24th. Science fails to provide an adequate explanation for tonight's events. The boy spoke of a tragedy as it unfolded miles away, with a specificity that defies our understanding of perception. If we are to maintain our commitment to rational inquiry, we must acknowledge that there exist phenomena beyond our current ability to explain. The rescue of Catherine Winters transformed James from a curiosity to a local hero, though the boy himself showed no satisfaction in the outcome. Instead, he lapsed into a deep melancholy, speaking little and eating only when coaxed. When Dr. Harper finally managed to engage him in conversation about the Winters fire, James's response was haunting in its simplicity. "I couldn't save the others," he said. "They were already gone when I saw them. Mrs. Winters was the only one still happening, the only one I could change." As 1868 drew to a close, the investigation into James Worrell's extraordinary abilities continued, but with a shifted focus. The question was no longer just how James knew what he knew, but whether his gift, if that's what it was, could be understood and possibly harnessed to prevent future tragedies. The dawn of 1869 brought both closure and new beginnings to the case of James Elias Worrell. Following the dramatic events of the Winters fire and Catherine's rescue, public interest in the prophetic Orphan reached unprecedented levels. Newspapers across the Midwest carried the story, and Williams Asylum received dozens of inquiries about James from families seeking lost loved ones, academic institutions proposing studies, and even spiritualist groups claiming the boy as evidence of their beliefs. Through this storm of attention, Sheriff Rutledge maintained his protective stance, limiting access to James and focusing on completing his official investigation. On January 5, 1869, Rutledge filed his final report, a comprehensive document spanning 64 pages that chronicled the case from James's disappearance through the rescue of Catherine Winters. The report's conclusion remains one of the most remarkable statements ever entered into McLean County's official records. After exhaustive investigation and the elimination of all conventional explanations, Rutledge wrote, "This office must conclude that James Elias Worrell possesses an ability to perceive or experience fire-related tragedies across time in a manner that defies current scientific understanding. While we cannot explain the mechanism of this ability, we have verified its accuracy in 14 separate incidents, culminating in the successful rescue of Catherine Winters on December 23, 1868. It is the finding of this investigation that the boy's abilities, while extraordinary, are neither fraudulent nor symptomatic of mental derangement, but represent a genuine phenomenon worthy of further study under appropriate conditions that prioritize his welfare." The immediate question following the investigation's conclusion was what would become of James. His return to Williams Asylum was briefly considered but ultimately rejected by Mrs. Gresham, who expressed concern about the institution's ability to provide the specialized care and privacy James would require. Dr. Harper proposed that James remain at Bloomington General Hospital for continued observation, but hospital administrators worried about the disruption caused by persistent public interest. An unexpected solution emerged through Tobias Whitcomb, the Chicago industrialist who had visited James at the orphanage. Having followed the case closely after Deputy Hayes's interview, Whitcomb traveled to Bloomington in early January and proposed a bold arrangement. He would establish a private trust for James's education and care, funding a small, secure residence where the boy could be looked after by qualified staff while being studied by selected researchers under strictly controlled conditions. "Having lost my family to fire," Whitcomb explained in a letter to Sheriff Rutledge dated January 10th, "I recognize the profound importance of James's abilities, both as a scientific anomaly and as a potential means of preventing similar tragedies. I propose not to exploit the boy, but to create conditions where his gift might be understood and possibly developed for the greater good." After careful consideration and consultation with Dr. Harper, Sheriff Rutledge endorsed Whitcomb's proposal. The McLean County Court appointed Whitcomb as James's legal guardian on January 22, 1869, with specific provisions requiring quarterly reports on the boy's welfare and ongoing oversight from county officials. By February 1869, James had been relocated to a modest but comfortable house on the outskirts of Bloomington, staffed by a nurse, a tutor, and a housekeeper, all under the supervision of Dr. Harper, who had taken a sabbatical from his regular practice to focus on James's case. Professor Montgomery from Illinois State Normal University was granted limited access to conduct non-invasive studies of James's abilities, with a strict protocol ensuring the boy's comfort and consent. The most significant development in understanding James's abilities came not through formal study, but through the boy's own growing self-awareness. As he adjusted to his new environment and the intense pressure of the investigation subsided, James began to articulate more clearly how his visions functioned. "It's like a door that opens inside me," he explained to Dr. Harper during a documented session on February 15th. "Sometimes I can feel it starting to open. There's a warmth that begins in my chest and spreads outward. When the door opens completely, I'm not myself anymore. I'm someone else, someone who's dying or about to die in a fire. I feel what they feel, see what they see, know what they know in those last moments." This description aligned with what Dr. Harper had observed during James's episodes: elevated body temperature, altered respiration, and a dissociative state during which James would speak in voices or mannerisms distinct from his own. Harper theorized that James was experiencing a form of psychic empathy specifically attenuated to fire victims, possibly triggered by his own trauma. The pattern of James's connections to the 14 fire incidents revealed another intriguing aspect of his ability. Dr. Harper and Professor Montgomery mapped the locations and dates of all confirmed cases and discovered that they formed a rough spiral pattern centered on Bloomington, with the earliest incident, Margaret Schuyler's death in 1859, occurring furthest from the center, and the most recent, Elizabeth Winter's in 1868, closest to James's current location. It appears that James's perceptions are constrained by both geography and chronology, Professor Montgomery wrote in his preliminary findings. His awareness seems to have expanded outward through time and space from a focal point, suggesting that his ability may continue to evolve in scope and precision. The question of whether James could perceive future fire tragedies beyond the Winters case remained open. Throughout the spring of 1869, he experienced several episodes that he identified as new flames, but none resulted in specific predictions that could be verified. Whether this represented a limitation of his ability or simply a fortunate absence of major fires in the region was impossible to determine. The impact of James's case extended far beyond Bloomington. By mid-1869, his story had been reported in newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco, often with sensationalistic embellishments that bore little resemblance to the careful documentation maintained by Sheriff Rutledge and Dr. Harper. Academic journals in the emerging field of psychology published more measured accounts, positioning James as a case study in trauma response and possible extrasensory perception. For Catherine Winters, the child James had helped save, the connection to the unusual boy became a defining element of her young life. After her mother's funeral, Catherine was taken in by her maternal aunt and uncle who lived in Springfield. They made a point of bringing Catherine to visit James several times throughout 1869, believing that the bond between the children, one who had lost a parent to fire and one who had somehow transcended normal perception to prevent a similar loss, might be healing for both. These visits proved remarkably beneficial, particularly for James. In Catherine's presence, he appeared more relaxed and engaged in typical childhood activities, temporarily freed from the burden of his abilities. Dr. Harper noted that James experienced no episodes during or immediately after Catherine's visits, suggesting that positive emotional connections might help regulate his unusual perceptions. As for the 14 victims whose deaths James had remembered, a memorial service was held in Bloomington Cemetery on the anniversary of James's discovery there. Tobias Whitcomb commissioned a modest stone monument listing the names of all 14 individuals, including Elizabeth Winters, with the inscription, "Though separated by time and circumstance, united in memory through extraordinary compassion." James attended the ceremony, his first public appearance since the conclusion of the investigation. By late 1869, the intensity of public interest in James had begun to wane, allowing him a measure of normalcy. His education progressed under the guidance of his tutor, and Dr. Harper reported significant improvements in his overall health and emotional stability. James continued to experience occasional visions, but their frequency and intensity diminished as he developed techniques to manage the opening door he had described. The long-term impact of James Worrell's case on the scientific and spiritual discourse of the late 19th century was substantial. His documented abilities challenged the strictly materialist view of human consciousness that had been gaining prominence, suggesting possibilities that extended beyond conventional understanding. For spiritualists and religious communities, James represented evidence of divine intervention or the existence of capabilities beyond the physical realm. For the residents of Bloomington who had witnessed the events firsthand, the case left an indelible mark on the community's identity. Local lore embraced James as the boy who remembered, and annual fire safety initiatives were organized in his name, continuing long after the direct memory of the events had faded. Tobias Whitcomb remained James's guardian until the boy reached adulthood, funding his education through university and maintaining the trust that ensured his financial security. Whitcomb's annual reports to McLean County documented James's development into a thoughtful, intelligent young man whose unusual childhood had shaped but not defined him. As James matured into adulthood, his episodes gradually became less frequent. By his 18th birthday in 1877, he had experienced no visions for nearly 2 years. Dr. Harper, who had maintained detailed records of James's development, theorized that the ability had served its purpose, perhaps as a psychological response to trauma that allowed James to process his own loss through connecting with others who had suffered similarly. In 1880, James enrolled at the University of Illinois to study psychology, one of the earliest students in this emerging field. His unique perspective and first-hand experience with unexplained phenomena shaped his academic career. After graduation, he worked alongside Professor Montgomery at Illinois State Normal University, contributing to early research on trauma and memory. The connection between James and Catherine Winters endured throughout their lives. In 1886, they were married in a small ceremony in Bloomington, attended by Tobias Whitcomb, Sheriff Rutledge, by then retired, and Dr. Harper. Their marriage was described by friends as uncommonly harmonious, founded on a bond that transcended ordinary understanding. The Winters house fire became a catalyst for improved fire safety regulations throughout Illinois. Tobias Whitcomb, inspired by James's abilities, dedicated much of his fortune to fire prevention research and the establishment of better-equipped fire departments across the Midwest. The Whitcomb Fire Safety Act of 1872 mandated new construction standards that saved countless lives. McLean County preserved the records of James's case in a special archive, where they remain available to serious researchers. While scientific explanations for his abilities have been proposed, from electromagnetic sensitivity to subconscious observation, none fully account for the verified accuracy of his perceptions, particularly in cases like Margaret Schuyler's death, where information was nearly inaccessible. In 1915, as an elderly man of 56, James granted a rare interview to the Chicago Tribune on the occasion of Tobias Whitcomb's passing. When asked about his childhood experiences, he offered a perspective tempered by decades of reflection. What happened to me was neither miracle nor madness, but perhaps something in between. A window briefly opened between one soul and others across the barrier of time. Science may someday explain what I experienced, but explanation doesn't diminish the profound responsibility that came with seeing through others' eyes at their most vulnerable moments. The 14 souls I carried with me taught me that memory itself can be an act of compassion. James Elias Worrell died peacefully in his sleep on October 12, 1926, at the age of 67. In accordance with his wishes, he was buried in Evergreen Cemetery, near the Henderson family graves where he had been found as a child. His tombstone bears a simple inscription: "He remembered those who would otherwise be forgotten." The case of the orphan who remembered the deaths of 14 strangers remains one of the most thoroughly documented yet unexplained phenomena of the 19th century. It challenges us to consider the boundaries of human perception and the mysteries that exist at the intersection of trauma, memory, and consciousness. Mysteries that, even in our modern age, continue to elude complete understanding. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these cases that forever mark families. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and understand who truly cares about the search for truth. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary investigations, and share with others who appreciate the depth of these historical mysteries. Together, we ensure that cases like James Worrell's are never forgotten.